Okay, folks, let's talk about karma. Karma, perhaps, as I said in the last lecture, is one of the most known, if not the most known word that draws from Hinduism and later Buddhism. It's also an aspect of Buddhism. And it's a good starting point to see our Western conception of karma. But as you'll see, in Hinduism, it means something deeper and more subtle than the way we normally think about it. So, for example, we normally think about karma in terms of the phrase, what goes around comes around, right? If you're an asshole, something bad's going to happen to you. If you're a good person, you help others, something good will happen to you. It's not entirely wrong, but like I said, it's a little too surface level. And right away, we can see that it's just simply not how the world works. Now, granted, I don't know if any of you are aware of I think it's a Reddit channel or a Reddit, what's it called, thread that's called Instant Karma. And I have to admit that sometimes I look at it and I see the guy that cut somebody off, and then later he gets pulled over by a cop, and everybody watches those to get that sense of gratification of seeing somebody get what they deserve. But unfortunately, lots of times people don't get what they deserve, quote unquote, right? There's people that we all love those stories of somebody who gets their comeuppance, as we say it. But there's many stories of people who are bad and evil and maybe even harm others significantly, and they just keep getting rewarded with more money, with a beautiful wife or husband or whatever, with more things, with more friends. And of course, there's people epitomized by Job in the Bible who are really genuinely good people, and they don't get rewarded. They get the opposite. They suffer. Now, I understand the story of Job in the Bible has other sort of implications related to Christianity. I'm not going to that. I'm just using him as an example of that kind of person. But the point is that what goes around comes around just isn't quite deep enough to explain what Hindus are really trying to say by it. And so karma is really, in Hinduism, it literally means action, right? The word in Sanskrit. But it's the deeper meaning is the moral law of cause and effect, right? And like I said in the last video on Dharma, Dharma and karma work together. Because Dharma says there's this divine order, this web of the universe, that everything plays a part and we have a responsibility. Karma really focuses on that responsibility and the cause and effect within that web. And once the end result of the web hits us, that's where the karma comes in. So, for example, I gave the example in the last video, and I'll just follow up and I'll add karma to it. In the last video in explaining Dharma, I gave the example of my former construction job, where I had to do one thing, which was typically put roof or mostly gutter on a house, as long as as well as downspouts up in Northern California. And I gave the example of what that process entails. So there's the gutter machine, that bends this really high level sheet metal into the shape of a gutter. There's the guy who builds the downspouts. There's the boss. The wholesaler producing the materials that my boss buys and picks up. All of this is leading to the moment when I, as a worker, had to take that material, bend it into the shape of a gutter, and put it on the house. So the karma is the result of that cause and effect and my moral duty to play my part in that role. So again, it fits with Dharma, but it focuses on the morality of the cause and effect in the chain, in the web of Dharma, if you will. So now let's think of something else there. In that process of the me putting up the gutter, there's all sorts of other webs of interconnectedness, aren't there? Right? There's the environmental damage being caused by the trucks we're driving to get there. There's we're probably killing animals and insects and ants and an occasional squirrel we might run over on the way. There's this interconnected web of nature and reality that everything is being influenced by, right? There's the petroleum, there's the way that is produced and taken from the ground and taken to there's the gas we get on the way. There's the food we buy on the way. We would often stop at a gas station and get a snack on the way to the job. Right? There's all these interconnected webs. And a good way to think about it is that everything we do, this is a metaphor, of course, everything we do creates a ripple, and the pond of reality, right? In the pond that is reality, it's a ripple, just ripple after ripple after ripple. Everything we do has these ripples that extend out often into many, many, many years into the future. So, for example, think of somebody like Martin Luther. Think of people who had incredible effects on the universe. And again, here I'm trying to deepen your understanding of karma to show you that it's not just you did something bad immediately happens to you, right? It's much more complex and deep. So think of people like Martin Luther King Jr., Jesus, Socrates, the Buddha himself. People who have had this great deep effect. Mother Teresa, on the universe, that had the ripples, going back to the metaphor of the pond, have reached way beyond their time into the future to influence other human beings. Right? Martin Luther King, for instance, his message was so profound that to this day, people are still reading his letter from Birmingham jail. They're still motivated to address racial justice based on his message. Let's think about Jesus, right? Jesus has this message of peace and love for all. And yes, other people before him had similar messages, but in that particular place and time, Jesus' message really resonated. I'm gonna heal the sick. He said many people at that time in the Middle East were thinking about their tribe, and they cared about their people, but not the people outside their tribe. Jesus says, everyone's in my tribe, right? Everyone's in my tribe. I care for the sick and the dying and the people that others have thrown away. So much so that his message resonates so much, and to use the words of karma, ripples into the universe so much that in the first couple hundred years of the Roman Empire, Christians go from being persecuted to being the ones who are running the empire, right? Because, for example, the message influences eventually Constantine the emperor, who adopts Christianity as the major religion of Rome. And even after Rome as an empire crumbles in the next several hundred years, that message of Christianity continues to spread. Now, granted, some of you are thinking, yes, it spread through the sword. There were battles, but that's true of every religion, including Buddhism. They spread in many different ways. The point isn't to judge that, but to show you the way that the ripples of one particular person's actions or ideas can ripple out into the universe, into the future. And so that's karma, right? Karma is this deeply interconnected web of which we all have a responsibility in, but we are all a part of. And so let's think about another question real quick. Think about the question is it possible not to act? Is it possible not to act at all? Well, I can sit still and do nothing, but even then, I'm sort of acting, aren't I? I'm still processing the food that I ate earlier this morning in my stomach. My blood is still pumping. My heart is still pumping. There is still action, even though it's an apparent stillness. There's still action that's happening. So another way to say it is that action is inescapable from this perspective of karma, from the Vedanta Hindu perspective. You cannot not act. And even think about sometimes, I don't know if you guys have ever been in a conversation where you didn't respond to somebody. Maybe the person was kind of ranting and you were done listening to them and they're not listening to you. So you just kind of check out of the conversation. That can have a real impact, can't it? Somebody's kind of talking at you and suddenly they say, yeah, what do you think about that? And you just kind of go, You just don't respond because you checked out because you don't feel like you're part of it. That can sometimes have a deep impact on the person speaking. They might get offended, but they might also stop and say, okay, well, what do you think? Right? And then you can contribute. But the point is that there's no such thing as true non-action from this perspective. Everything you do, even sitting still, is a result of a number and web of series of causes that led you where you are now. Right? Another way to say it is that nothing fundamentally causes itself to exist from the perspective of Hinduism. In fact, later when we talk about the Bhagavad Gita, which is one of the central texts in Hinduism, as I'm sure many of you know already, the main dilemma faced, the Bhagavad Gita kind of starts with a guy named Arjuna on a battlefield, and he goes out, he's taken out into the battlefield, and he notices that people on both sides, there's people he's going to have to kill and fight against who he grew up with, who were friends. And the dilemma kind of starts when he falls down and says, I don't want to do this. I don't want to act. And fundamentally, the whole book is about how and why he should act and what it really entails. So this question of what should I do and how should I deal with the result of the karma that has taken me to this moment is a core question in the Hindu thinking. So I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the caste system again. Because the caste system, that's really how the concept of karma, when the concept of karma was being created in the early Vedic period, if you remember from the first and second chapter of the textbook, the caste system was alive and well. And as I said in the last lecture, it's sort of still alive and well, even though it was outlawed. But anyways, it was even more in full force several thousand years back in the Vedic period. And to the point where karma was thought to be different depending on what caste you were in. So if you were born into a higher caste, that was often seen as your dharma. It's just the kind of structure and order of the universe. That's your part of the order. And you have certain karma based on that caste. But what I want to point to is there were actually people who were outcasts, literally not included in the caste system because they were seen to be barely better than animals. They were called Dalits, and I'm trying to remember what the translation was. Untouchables. They were called untouchables. And they were treated in a way that people would treat cattle, almost worse. They lived on the outskirts of the cities, and to the point where if somebody who was of a higher caste even just laid eyes on a Dalit, they were said to now be unclean and they had to cleanse themselves, both literally physically wash themselves, but also mentally clear themselves of having seen that person. Right? Imagine the harshness and impact of that. How would you justify that? Well, the way they justified it was karma. They said, well, and this kind of touches on, we'll talk about samsara and reincarnation in the next video. They said, well, in a past life, these people were murderers or rapists. That's why they're Dalits. That's why they're in that position. So they said that's their part of the divine order. Now, again, this was challenged by the Buddha later, but the point is that the idea of karma goes way back and it's deeply interconnected with the Dharma, the divine order of the universe. So one last thing I want to mention here is the concept of what's sometimes called free will versus determinism. Those of you who've taken philosophy before will know that debate, and I'm not going to go into the details, but I'll just say, you can probably tell already from what I said, do we have free will, or are we determined based on kind of the past and laws of nature that produce what we are now? And there's a lot of evidence from recent science that suggests we're much less free than we think. Our minds are sort of determined by these variables and psychological tendencies that are predicted by evolution and things like that. But so what are Buddhists telling us? Because it seems like there's a contradiction here, right? It seems like Buddhists are telling us in the karmic web, well, on the one hand, you don't choose who you are, you don't choose your parents, you don't choose this deep web of existence that led to your existence. You don't choose the language you speak even, right? In some sense, you could argue you don't choose your vocation because it's only going to be based on the culture that you were put into, what options you have. On the other hand, we all have this indispensable feeling of free will. And from the perspective of Hindu Vedanta tradition, they are also saying karma has a moral element that like you should or shouldn't do something, right? There's an element of choice. So the way that Buddhists look at this, Hindus look at this is really a both and. They would of course acknowledge that we are indeed products of this deep web of the cosmic order and we have a duty based on karma also. So we're both determined by a number of forces, but we also have free will in that we can at least send ripples into the pond or ocean of the universe. So there's another philosophy we won't study in this class, but some of you may have heard of, Stoicism. And they make a similar point. They say, look, we don't choose who we are, the similar thing that I just went over, but we can influence the universe. We have enough to influence. So there is free will at the top level of this web of dharma. And so karma does mean something in the sense that we really do have a choice in terms of, do we follow our duty and do the right thing and act in a way that's karmic and we try to better the universe and put good ripples into the universe, or do we do the opposite of that? Right? So They would answer it's what Western philosophers call compatibleism, meaning that free will and determinism are compatible. It doesn't have to be one or the other. So, anyways, I will leave you with a couple thoughts. One is think about karma in terms of our eating behavior. And without any judgment, just think about the things you eat and where they come from, right? The result of getting those eggs in the supermarket, getting grass-fed beef versus normally produced beef, right? The difference between pumping cows full of hormones and sort of hanging them on hooks and treating them more fairly. Yes, you're killing them in both cases, but notice that the result of that, the karma will be different. You'll be doing more or less harm to the universe based on what you choose. So even just the choice of what you eat can have a background. You see the chicken packaged in the supermarket. There's a background of karmic causes happening through the Dharma, leading you to see the chicken in front of you that way. And without judging anyone, I would just ask you to consider those webs of causation and cause and effect that lead you to see what you see in the supermarket. Now, next, we're going to deepen these ideas with the discussion of samsara. I mentioned it in this video earlier, which refers to the wheel or web of life. And that relates to another common idea that we hear about in the West called reincarnation, which is the idea that we reincarnate through different, they call them rebirths, through this wheel of life. And ultimately, I'll leave you with this final thought. Moksha is the idea of liberation from the cycle. So in Buddhist philosophy, they call it enlightenment. They call it moksha in Hinduism, but it's the idea of liberating yourself and reaching a higher level of consciousness, which again, like I always say, goes back to the Brahman, meaning you realize your true nature as Brahman and you disconnect yourself from this cycle of life and suffering.